Hi, welcome to the Communitarian Podcast. The aim of such a project is to explore and examine the philosophy of communitarianism, the central premise being the emphasis of the community as opposed to the individual. Unsurprisingly, such a broad philosophy can be found to be part of the subject matter of religion, science, and politics, and much more besides. Therefore, in no particular order, I will explore such ideas. Thanks for listening, and leave your comments below. Hi, this is part 2 of my exploration of Kropotkin's ideas, titled Kropotkin Asks, Why Don't We Take Such Evidence Seriously? Much of what has been discussed so far seems logical and necessary repercussion of our evolutionary past. Kropotkin then asks an intriguing question, why don't we take such evidence seriously? What is the true repercussions of such a line of inquiry? And why hasn't it transpired? Put simply, Kropotkin believes that such evidence has a fundamental repercussions and demands the basis of a new progressive development in civilization, otherwise known as anarchism. Darwin also had high aspirations for what he uncovered, believing that his work was not limited to biology or anthropology, but instead, as he notes in his diary, quote, "My theory will lead to a new philosophy." Let's briefly consider the source of these aspirations. The publication of The Origin of Species is probably one of the most famous proclamations of the modern era. Its influence has been vast and far-reaching. In general terms, it has taught the human species a valuable lesson in modesty. We do not represent the purpose of the universe, and our creator was nothing but the forces of nature. However, both Kropotkin and Darwin clearly show that science has something to say about morality of human beings. It is an account of the natural origin of our morality without relying on any external factors, be it superstitions, transcendental, or metaphysical. Also, the evolution of our social instincts predate the rise of civilization itself. It was our anonymous ancestors who developed and maintained our social instincts, of which we so highly value today. Such a line of inquiry has largely been ignored or neglected. Kropotkin very passionately puts forward the case that such a misjudgment has done the human race a grave disservice, since mutual aid is to be considered a positive, established scientific truth, if properly understood and studied, can provide faith in moral progress. It potentially possesses a scientific basis to elevate moral feelings to greater heights and purity. Ethics as a science. As Kropotkin puts it, quote, "We are forced to acknowledge that the social qualities of man constitute the pinnacle factor in his past development and in his future progress." End of quote. Progress which Kropotkin wishes to see is but to match the scientific revolution of the mid to late 18th century. Prior to this, many areas of science were plagued by superstition and metaphysics. Kropotkin summarizes, quote, "Thus science and philosophy has given us both the material strength and the freedom of thought which are required for calling into life the constructive forces that may lead mankind to a new era of progress. There is, however, one branch of knowledge which lags behind. It is ethics, the teaching of the fundamental principles of morality." End of quote. Why hasn't this transpired? Kropotkin identifies a number of different culprits which have suppressed such an advancement. I have thus summarized them under the following topics: skepticism of scientism, bad science, incompatibility with religion, incompatibility with government, inaccurate moral theories, supposed decay of morality, economic individualism. Let's consider each of these culprits one by one. Skepticism of scientism. It is an understandable reaction against scientism, the idea that science can dogmatically be applied to areas of knowledge for which it is not appropriate, since surely it is not appropriate for science to determine what is right and wrong. However, Kropotkin's argument is not to show how science provides a codified moral command, but instead to demonstrate that there is evidence for a naturalistic explanation of moral instincts, which, if understood correctly, could be refined and grow stronger. It is directional, not dictatorial. What happens if the science is wrong? Does this prove that science cannot make any judgment about morality? Kropotkin's response is to the point. What choice do we have but to follow the scientific method? The only alternative is to leave such questions to superstition and metaphysics. Kropotkin makes the following analogy. Quote, "We may not be able to fully explain the origin of the planets revolving around the sun, but the planets revolve nonetheless, and one of them carries us with it in space." End of quote. We cannot avoid using science and reason to understand such a pivotal and necessary part of our everyday existence. Bad science, an incorrect understanding of evolution. A key question to ask is, why didn't the scientific community come to the same conclusion? Why is it just Kropotkin and Darwin? The explanation given by Kropotkin is that such a line of inquiry was jeopardized from the moment Darwin released The Origin of Species. Effectively, an incorrect analysis of evolution was appropriated. Many of the reasons why figures like Thomas Huxley proposed this agenda is a matter to be discussed in other topics shortly. To simplify, individual prejudice led to bad science. The misunderstanding was to overemphasize the role of the individual competition in evolution. Its motto was survival of the fittest, as understood as the greatest combatant. Such a vision is immediately incompatible with any attempts to provide a naturalistic account of morality, since nature is governed by evolution which is inherently amoral. Therefore it would be absurd to even explore the evidence of social instincts amongst animals, let alone amongst wild savages. Interestingly, Darwin himself tried to correct such a misunderstanding with his publication of The Descent of Man. However, it was 12 years too late and passed unnoticed. Darwin remarks, quote, "The social instincts, which must have been acquired by man in a very rude state, and probably even by his ape-like progenitors, still give the impulse for some of his best actions." Incompatibility with religion. It is incompatible because the majority of world religions consider man's best actions to be primarily a religious incarnation. Many of the identifying features of such religions are to provide an antidote to our corrupted and untrustworthy instincts. For instance, within Christianity there is original sin, within Buddhism there is samsara. Quote, "The triumph of moral principles was thus represented as the triumph of man over nature, which he may hope to achieve only from an aid from without, coming as a reward for his good intentions." End of quote. This becomes a major obstacle in correctly understanding the true basis for man's moral appetite. The problem is exacerbated, since religions can't even concede to what Kropotkin is insisting, because it represents its crucial defining feature. However, as Kropotkin correctly identifies, it is wrong and unscientific. Instead, he encourages us to think of religion as an imitator or even a charlatan. Since we know that our social instincts predate the formulation of any formal religions, we can then conclude that religions and formalized laws have only borrowed from the ever-practiced social instincts. In fact, it is only by aligning itself to something so innate within us that it is able to take a hold and build its authority. As Kropotkin puts it, quote, "When the founders of religions, philosophers and moralists tell us of a divine or metaphysical entities, they are only recasting what each ant, each sparrow practices in its little society." End of quote. Incompatibility with government. The institution of governance is too incompatible with such a naturalistic explanation. Kropotkin delivers a similar critique to that of religion. It seems appropriate to go into greater depth around such a critique, since many would consider government to be a progressive step away from unscientific scripture. Of course this is true, however it does fall foul of the same inaccurate assumptions as religion. Therefore it is important to put aside any idealization we have of the state with its function as lawmaker. Instead we must remember what Kropotkin boldly claims about government's ability to write laws. Quote, "Not contributed anything useful that was not developed previously in customary law. They may have emphasized some useful existing customs, but they have not invented them. End of quote. However, we have become complacent and let ourselves believe that such legal institutions represent the pinnacle and purest expression of justice. We have come to believe that, quote, the possession of the truth, not the religious preacher, but the lawmaker. End of quote. Why is this so readily accepted? Without a doubt, the domain of legal laws, as opposed to religious scripture, was a progressive step forwards. The expression of the separation of church and state comes to mind. Kropotkin helps us realize that our readiness to accept legal authority is actually built upon a similar assumption of that of religion, that our natural instincts are not to be trusted. This is famously articulated by the political writings of Thomas Hobbes. To grossly summarize, he essentially believed that without a strong government, man would be in a constant, quote, condition of war of everyone against everyone. Kropotkin makes an observation which could easily be missed. If man is instinctively warlike, then isn't it utopian thinking to believe that our natural behaviour can be manipulated by the prestigious forces of legal authority or statehood? Cleverly, Kropotkin is flipping on its head an obvious attack made by those who wish to demoralize the natural prominence of goodness in man as being utopian. The Hobbesian incorrect prognosis requires the necessity of legal systems and government institutions just to keep us under control. But more importantly, it requires a political class to steer the ship through the inevitable stormy waters of human hatred and degradation. This explains why we are so ready to leave matters to the politicians. As Kropotkin rightly identifies, we have become, quote, accustomed to supposing that the state and political men are everything. End of quote. Of course not, and Kropotkin's message is that we all share the same social capacities, and therefore we can all positively construct and maintain society. To believe otherwise is incompatible with how we have evolved as a social animal. Inaccurate moral theories. What have moral philosophers contributed to the progress of ethics as a science? There has been a major push since the 17th century to ground morality in reason. However positive this may sound, it has largely neglected any naturalistic explanation, and therefore has shown itself to be impractical and inaccurate. A classic case of this is Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Kant's work is held as one of the greatest achievements of the Enlightenment, and has influenced many aspects of our society. However, who actually lives in accordance to the categorical imperatives? No one, since this moral work has never really sparked the imagination of the everyday person. Kropotkin identifies the problem clearly. Even if an academic proposes a logical moral system, why should we obey it? Reason alone does not fully explain or facilitate the full depth of our moral lives. Put another way, moral choices are not cold calculated reflections of reason. What is missing is a scientific and naturalistic basis for morality, which provides an explanation of moral conscience, remorse, and empathy, etc. The fact that moral philosophers do not do this, many of them, most famously Kant, after 4 years of pondering, had to ironically rely on irrational metaphysics or religious superstition to provide an explanation of such qualities. Amorality. Another reason why such an inquiry has not been seriously considered is because of the apparent questioning of the existence of morality itself. Although such an idea is not modern, for instance, Bernard Mandevilla in 1714 published The Fable of the Bees, in which he depicted morality as nothing more than a set of conventions. However, it was not until the 19th century, with the pending decline of religion, that the thinker Friedrich Nietzsche boldly claimed that God is dead, and so too is our pretense of holding on to moral values. Although it is popular to stipulate how we live in a nihilistic age, in reality people in general do not live their lives as if it has no meaning. It is for this reason why Kropotkin believes that such ideas have only artistic value. He makes it clear that amoralism is inconsistent with our natural origins. Quote, Not only does nature fail to give us a lesson in amoralism, but we are bound to recognize the very lessons of good and bad, and man's attractions concerning the supreme good have been borrowed from nature. Economic individualism. This final point is slightly complicated. As has been argued by Kropotkin, our social instincts are innate to our nature as a social animal. However, crucially, this does not mean that we as human beings always act or recognize such instincts. As will be explored in greater depth later, the mechanism of morality should instead be considered a craft, which requires cultivation. Kropotkin's prognosis of our current society is that such a craft is neglected, and therefore there is a general decline of morality's standing in society. Such a decline in value has to some extent increased feelings of meaninglessness, but crucially it has allowed for the new ideal to fill the void, economic individualism. Such an inquiry attracts the following question: how is it that our social instincts could be dethroned in such a way? Instead, for the time being, let's consider the characteristics of economic individualism, and how such a set of ideas bears little resemblance to our naturalistic explanation of social values. Individualism is the dominant and technical term for the glorification of amoralism. Individuals desire to live a morally apathetic life in which their own self-interest is the greatest importance. Such a narrative implies that each individual should pursue their own economic and material interests. Such an ideal has attracted thoughts and ideas which support the existence of supposed natural laws which represent natural human behavior. Kropotkin identifies the accepted laws within such an economic paradigm. Individuals only naturally seek to compete against one another. Individuals can naturally dominate others as an economic right. Inequality is a natural expression of such economic activity. Poverty is a natural product of the inadequacies of individuals. Notice how such an understanding is supposedly based on naturalistic evidence. However, clearly this has little correlation to well-established evolved social instincts. Kropotkin ultimately dismisses all such laws as the ramblings of a pseudoscience or superstition. The rather bizarre problem we face is that such an economic paradigm has widely been accepted as if it does represent our natural instincts. As a result, any inquiry or investigation to the contrary appears controversial or unpalatable, ultimately playing its part to suppress the inquiry into the naturalistic explanation for morality. Thanks for listening. The next podcast is about Kropotkin's alternative approach.